Hello FPL managers, I'm Oscar, and in this video we will examine how the 3 best premiums in the game performed last season. This should help us see if there are any tendencies we should keep in mind when choosing our captains and choosing our Game Week 1 team. If you're not a member yet, you can sign up through the link in the description and get a 20% discount. We will soon take a look at how the 3 highest scoring players from last season, Kane, Salah and Fernandes, performed versus the bottom 8 teams. They are also the 3 highest owned premiums at the moment. Another aim with this video is to figure out if there are any players that we consider as flat track bullies, meaning they do particularly well versus the worst opponents. And this is of course a desirable trait when it comes to captains, because FPL is about predictions, and if it's easier to predict a player scoring well versus a poor team, then we can captain him with more confidence. Now there are some things to consider with using the method I have chosen. I have chosen to focus on how premiums have performed versus the bottom 8 sides. One problem here is that it's hard to know during a season or beforehand which 8 teams are going to be the 8 worst. And also not all bottom 8 teams in a season are super leaky either. But why I chose bottom 8 and for instance not bottom 4 instead is that you're probably not going to have a player in your team facing a relegated tipped team each week, unless you're making it a point to prioritize transfers to have the best captain each week. I looked at Kane, Bruno's and Salah's FPL scores versus bottom 8 last season, but I have counted Newcastle as a bottom 8 team instead of Wolves. Even though Newcastle finished above them in the table, they finished on the same points, but Newcastle had scored more goals, but they conceded more, and there was certainly more eagerness for most managers to captain a player versus Newcastle rather than Wolves, and for a good reason. There's one last thing to keep in mind when looking at these comparisons, and it's I only use one metric to evaluate performances, and that's FPL points. It's not the most sophisticated approach. Many would perhaps prefer expected goal involvement as a metric, and FPL points are quite random in a sense. It can vary a lot from season to season depending on the luck of a player as well as his team. If you want me to incorporate more seasons of data or other data points that you think are relevant, let me know in the comments and we might do another video. Before we dive into last season's data of how Bruno, Kane and Salah performed versus the underdogs, I want to share some stats that that functioned as a starting point for me to help me guide my captaincy decisions last year, and that I hope can guide your captaincy decisions in the future. These are the stats from the 18-19 and the 19-20 season of how often premium strikers and midfielders had a point score of 5 or higher when facing a bottom 8 opposition. And here are the conversion rates in order of best to worst. Home games versus easy teams, the conversion rates was 78%. In home games versus either easy or hard teams was 68%. Versus easy teams, whether it was home or away, 68% conversion rate. In away games versus the easy teams, it was a 60% conversion rate. In the home games versus hard teams, it was a 59% conversion rate. And away games versus the hard teams was the worst. It was a 26% chance of scoring 5 or more points. If we go by this to help us make better captaincy decisions in the future, it's clear that there was one instance when you should never captain a player, and it's away games versus hard teams. And there is one instance where you should always captain, and that is the exact opposite scenario. The second takeaway is that playing easy opponents is equally attractive as playing at home. So away games versus easy opponents are equally attractive as home games to harder opponents, for instance. This helped me set up a couple of rules to try and apply. First rule, always captain a premium player in his home games. Second, always captain a premium player when he plays an easy opponent. And both of these strategies should work equally well by themselves, but they're naturally even more effective when combined. Last season was my best to date regarding picking the best captains. It was my highest captaincy score, but it wasn't thanks to this strategy, because it became apparent quite early on that due to no crowd allowed on the arenas, the home advantage was as good as gone. Instead, I had to find other ways to decide my captains. But now with crowds back in the arenas, I hope that the data from the seasons with fans becomes more relevant once again, and that this table I just showed you will be more helpful than it was last season. So that was an introduction. Now let's look at some data, and let's first take a look at Kane's stats from last season. First off, we have his home record versus easy opponents. He scored 7.71 points per game and scored 5 or more points in 6 of 7 games, which gives him a hit rate of 86%. And here the benchmark, as I mentioned earlier, is 78% among premiums in the seasons prior to this one. In the home games versus hard opposition, he had just a 45% hit rate, but still scored quite decent, 6.66 points per games, and his hit rate was just below the benchmark. Away versus easy opposition, he scored 9.7 points per game, so that was his best scenario. So a very good hit rate, 6 out of 7, well above the benchmark. And lastly, in his away games versus hard opposition, he scored 5.36 points per game, which is decent considering his hit rate was really low at just 36%, but it's actually above the benchmark, so he was still performing okay in the hard games considering how all the premiums usually score. So in conclusion, he scored in home games just below a benchmark, so 62.5%. And versus easy teams, he scored way above the benchmark. He scored in 12 out of 14 occasions. So meaning if you captained him in his easy games last season, you probably did quite well. So we can see that Kane was the perfect FPL captain, a true flat track bully with almost 9 points per game versus the bottom 8. To make the analysis even more interesting, it would be an idea to look at his underlying stats as well in these games. He probably overperformed his own expected stats from those games. And when there's a result that is extreme like this one, there's a good chance that his output drops a little to next season. Especially Kane's 14 assists seems quite hard to repeat considering his previous season stats. He is arguably more of a playmaker nowadays, but his expected assist was just over 7, so the 14 assists will be hard to repeat. After I have found about these data points, I wanted to see if a previous season could support the view of him being a flat track bully, and I looked at the 1920 season, the one before, where it actually was one of Kane's worst seasons in terms of FPL points, and personally I think it was his worst season in terms of footballing performance as well. His record in that season in home games versus easy opposition was just 5.3 points per game, where he scored a return in 57% of games. So not great by any means, and just like in 2021, his away record versus easy opponents was slightly better than his home record versus the same opponents, 6.5 points per game and a hit rate of 67%. As you can see, these are small sample sizes whichever season you look at, and whether he's a flat track bully or not isn't completely clear to me. There's probably a narrative around him being that, if you also consider how he has done in the last 2 international tournaments, being in the Golden Boot race in both those competitions, despite not scoring any memorable goals versus any especially tough opponents. Him scoring more points away from home in these seasons is interesting, however, and I'll keep this in mind in upcoming fixtures, and I might not be too discouraged if he was to play away from home. Let's look at Bruno's stats from last season. He joined Manchester United late in the 1920 season, and we have some stats from that time. He played bottom 8 in 6 times that season and only blanked once, which gives him a hit rate of 83%, and he scored an incredible 10.8 points per game in those 6 games. But let's look at last season, and he scored 5.89 points per game at home in the easy matches and had a hit rate of 50%. And as I said before, the benchmark there is 78%. And in the hard home games, he actually performed a little better, 6.5 points per game with a hit rate of 60%. which was just close to the benchmark of 59%. And in easy away games, he scored 6.33 points per game with a hit rate of 55%, around the benchmark, close to it. And in away games that were hard, he actually scored 7.33 points per game. So hard in this sense is top 12 teams. And we can see that Bruno had more blanks than Kane, but he was also more explosive than Kane, with more double digits hauls coming a bit more frequently. Kane scored double digit scores on 9 occasions and Bruno on 12. Another pattern is that Bruno seems to have been at his best versus some of the top 12 teams rather than versus the bottom 8. And as many of us can remember, he was blanking a lot, almost all of the games versus the very top teams. So maybe the takeaway here is actually that Bruno scores more and thrives more in certain types of games. Maybe that's versus mid-table teams or teams that play a certain brand of football. I think more research needs to be done here and more data to decide if any of this is true. But it was clear that Bruno's role in some of the games were a bit deeper and that he had less of a goal threat in those games. Let's move on lastly to Salah. The difference between him and Bruno and Kane last season was that he had a couple of seasons in a row behind him with great scores, which indicated he would very likely be the best consistent captaincy option for the 2021 season. But despite his high final score of 231 FPL points, he wasn't quite the flat track bully we had anticipated, and as he had been in the previous seasons. So this was his 2021 numbers. First off, home versus easy opposition, a meager 3.23 points per game with just a hit rate of 43%. In the home games versus hard opposition, he had a points per game average of 8.33 with a hit rate of 70. In away games versus easy opposition, again very low, 3.89 points per game with a hit rate of 43%. And in the away games versus hard opposition, he actually scored 8.22 points per game and a hit rate of 70%. All in all, in his home games, he scored on 59% of occasions, and versus easy teams, he scored in 43% of occasions. This was a freak season for Salah, because let's look at his 2 seasons prior to that. Versus bottom 8, he only blanked in 17% of games. He scored double digits on 37% of occasions, which is massive. In 2021, his average points per game versus bottom 8 was roughly 3.5 points. The 2 seasons before, he averaged 10 points per game versus bottom 8, which was the best in FPL by a significant amount, and even better than Kane's average of 9 points this last season. Now I'm gonna share my takeaways from these numbers. I think this video has shown how difficult it can be to get an idea of who the best flat track bully is at the moment, and how hard it can be to decide that based on just a couple of seasons of data, especially since last season was an outlier because of the fact that no crowd was present until the end. This difference in attendance also makes me more wary of trying to make conclusions based on it. At the same time, it is the latest season and therefore should be the season that represents players' abilities the most accurately. Another thing that also has become apparent to me is how different one season can be from the other. Before last season, most thought that De Bruyne would be essential and that Aubameyang would be one of the great assets thanks to his reclassification as midfielder. And there weren't many that foresaw the dip in quality of Mané and Sterling either. And if we compare Bruno's 1920 season to his 2021 season, these were both mostly without a crowd, and there was still a huge difference in his ability versus bottom 8 opposition in terms of average FPL points. How would these findings impact our game week 1 team selection in terms of Bruno, Kane and Salah? If we consider Salah first, in his first 3 seasons he was a flat track bully, and in his last season he wasn't. Here I think it's very useful to us that we know his track record, and I think we shouldn't draw too many conclusions from his last season in terms of who he is likely to score points against. It was a very weird season for Liverpool where they didn't smash the bottom teams like they did in the past, but Salah will always be more likely to score versus the bottom teams, and he is the best asset by far if we combine his score of the last 4 seasons. The fact that he scored a lot of points versus the tougher sides this season could be down to variance, or maybe that he has developed some kind of experience and developed some part of his game in those type of games. I haven't seen any stats, but my memory tells me that Liverpool were rather good versus top opposition last year. In summary, Salah had a great overall score despite Liverpool being below their previous levels. For instance, Mane had a worse than average season, and the partnership there with Salah was quite terrible overall, so there's definitely room for improvement there. And thus, my prediction is that if Liverpool improves from last season, which I think they will, then I think it's likely that Salah should improve his output from last season, and most importantly, be better versus the bottom teams. All of this makes him an auto pick in the Game Week 1 team, not just because he's the best FPL player of recent years, but also because if you don't own him and he explodes in the beginning of the season, it will be over before it started. Should we add Bruno or Kane, or perhaps someone else next to Salah in our teams? It can be tricky to fit in triple premium to have a balanced team, but having 2 premiums should be a good idea for rotating the captain's armband efficiently. The following speculation from me now is assuming Kane is still a Spurs player when the season starts, because if he's going to be a Manchester City player, there's going to be less doubts about him being worth the hefty price tag because he will have better delivery to him. I think one of the biggest question is, do you think Kane can replicate a similar season as last time? Consider that he was quite lucky to get the amount of assists as he did, and it was mostly thanks to Son's incredible goal scoring form. Of course, Kane delivered those assists. He's a great passer of the ball, but still maybe unlikely to replicate that. Another thing to consider is Spurs a better team now than it was with Pochettino. I think offensively they have more talent, and Kane and Son are in their prime, but if Bale goes back to Real Madrid, that might impact them slightly negatively. Comparing Kane and Bruno, there are certainly more doubts for me regarding Bruno's ability to kill it in the easier matchups, considering last season's results. If we look at how Salah and a Kane rotation would look like, it seems very juicy all the way up until Game Week 9. Even though I'm hesitant on Bruno as a flat track bully, he should be able to have a great season. Greenwood is likely getting better and better as his maturity grows. Cavani, if he stays, should have get used to the league more and get a little bit better chemistry maybe. But of course, the main thing is Sancho, who is a points player and should be able to score a lot on Bruno's chances, as well as set Bruno up for some nice passing and 1-2s. And of course, his dribbling should also give Manchester United a couple of penalties. Also consider that captaincy isn't everything. Kane's first fixture is so bad that you might not want to start the season with him. I'll give you one example. Let's say Bruno scores 8 more points than Kane in the opening 8 fixtures. If Kane only scores 1 more point than Bruno in the 4 games when you're going to captain one of them over Salah, this score of 8 points will be leveled out. That's how much captaincy will influence your decision. However, Kane is 0.5 more expensive, which can be a big deal. And lastly, I wouldn't commit to a 8 game week plan, since it's very likely that you'll want to wildcard in the first 5 game weeks or so. So a short-term approach would be considered safer. I've given you some things to consider, and I'm gonna end the video here. If you came this far, thank you for watching the whole thing. Please give the video a thumbs up. And if you're new to the channel, why not subscribe to get more content like this? I'll be posting stat-based videos every week this season. So I hope to see you soon. Until then, take care and good luck with your pre-season planning.